We are counting down the 8 most notorious deaths of illegal mountain climbers who ignored permits, closures, and warnings, and paid for it at high altitude. From covert border crossings to unauthorized winter ascents, each case showed how arrogance met altitude when shortcuts around permits, closures, and sacred site restrictions turned skill into fatal error. These were not mere accidents, but textbook examples in which bypassing regulations erased every safeguard and left climbers alone against the world's deadliest slopes. Which challengers' rule-breaking led to consequences so severe that a body remained unrecovered or recovery was refused by authorities? Let us begin with number 8. Spring 2018. A 30-something climber from Western Europe, known for previous summits on several 8,000-meter peaks, set his sights on Everest's north side. He possessed the technical skill and high-altitude experience that Chinese authorities required, but he refused to pay the permit fee of $11,000. Instead, he and a local fixer crossed the border into Tibet at night, bypassing official checkpoints and all legal documentation. Without a permit, his name never appeared on any expedition roster, and no search and rescue team was authorized to help if something went wrong. The choice was illegal and deliberate. At 27,000 feet, deep in the death zone, he encountered a sudden storm. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, and wind speeds reached 60 miles per hour. Forecasts had warned of a narrow weather window on the north side, and local officials had explained the requirement for permits and coordinated support, but those warnings were ignored. He carried no authorized GPS beacon, he performed no radio check-ins, and he had no formal support from the Chinese Mountaineering Association. He had chosen risk over regulation, and his lack of documented status removed the usual safeguards. At 27,200 hours into the push, his oxygen saturation began to fall. But as the storm intensified, a cascade was triggered. First, supplemental oxygen flow became intermittent under sustained winds. Second, hypoxia produced impaired judgment and slowed motor control. Third, he developed high-altitude cerebral edema with worsening confusion and loss of coordination. Fourth, attempts to descend were delayed by whiteout conditions and wind-driven ice. Finally, he collapsed on the upper slopes, unable to self-rescue. Distances were measured in hundreds of meters of exposed ice. Temperatures were below -20 degrees Celsius, and sustained winds exceeded 60 miles per hour, producing wind chill that accelerated hypothermia and impaired respiration. Clinically, neurological dysfunction consistent with high-altitude cerebral edema was observed in the sequence of events, followed by progressive hypothermia and respiratory compromise. No authorized rescue was launched because no team had jurisdiction to operate for an undocumented climber on that route. Time to death could not be precisely established, but he was pronounced unrecoverable at scene conditions. His body remained unrecovered, a permanent fixture above 8,200 meters, where recovery operations were refused without proper permits. In the aftermath, Chinese authorities expanded border patrols and imposed $50,000 fines for future illegal attempts, citing the need to deter permit evasion and to protect responders. Investigation reports emphasize that the lack of a permit directly removed authorized communications, tracking, and rescue coordination, and that the illegal entry into Tibet was the proximate factor in the failure of any official response. Enforcement changes were implemented to prevent similar violations. It was July 2019 when a 26-year-old German climber arrived in Zermatt, determined to film himself on a forbidden Matterhorn route for social media. The line had been closed after repeated rockfall, with signs warning of danger from thawing permafrost. Ignoring the ban, he and a partner slipped past barriers at dawn, aiming to capture footage before patrols appeared. The route, unmaintained for years, was stripped of anchors and riddled with unstable rock. Meteorological warnings and recent near misses underscored the risk, but he carried minimal gear, focused on speed and spectacle. He bypassed the permit process and skipped mandatory rescue registration. At 6:17 in the morning, while his partner filmed from below, he gripped a loose slab to set up a dramatic shot. The rock broke away, sending him plunging over 800 feet, 244 meters, onto the glacier. The impact caused multiple fractures and internal bleeding. Death followed within 15 minutes. Swiss prosecutors later fined his partner €30,000 for entering the closed sector, covering both penalties and rescue costs, and set a precedent for future violations. It was February 2020 when a 43-year-old climber from Eastern Europe arrived in Pakistan with a single goal: to summit K2 in the off-season. He was known for winter ascents in the Alps and the Pamirs, and he had a record of hard winter routes. Official permits for winter climbs required applications months in advance, but he timed his approach to exploit a narrow gap between permit windows, hoping to avoid both crowds and scrutiny. Without approval from the Gilgit-Baltistan authorities and without a registered liaison officer, his expedition operated outside legal oversight. He carried no official rescue beacon, and his name never appeared on the base camp manifest. Meteorological models for the Karakoram predicted sustained winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, which is over 160 kilometers per hour, along the upper ridge, with ambient temperatures dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. Local guides and Pakistani officials warned that jet stream conditions made any summit attempt suicidal in February, but the warnings were ignored. No rescue authorization would be granted for an unregistered climber, and helicopter access was impossible above 7,000 meters in winter storms. At 26,000 feet, which is 7,925 meters, while descending the bottleneck, a sudden gust caught him exposed on the ridge. The force of the wind lifted him off balance, sweeping him from the fixed line and into the abyss below. The fall trajectory entered a zone of avalanche debris and serac fragments, and recovery was rendered unrecoverable. His body was never found. In response, Pakistani authorities closed the permit loophole, instituting year-round permit requirements and increasing penalties for unauthorized climbs. Legal teams now faced stricter digital tracking, and unauthorized winter attempts were denied all search and rescue support. It was December 2017 when a 39-year-old climber from the United States arrived in New Zealand, determined to ascend a volcano that local authorities and indigenous leaders had declared off-limits. He was a veteran alpinist with nearly 20 years of high-altitude experience and a resume that included technical ascents on remote volcanic ridgelines. He was outspoken, confident, and confrontational in equal measure, publicly arguing that mountains belong to everyone and dismissing both government and cultural restrictions as unjustified barriers. Tall and lean, fast on steep ground, and quick to post his intentions online, he had announced his plan to reclaim a sacred peak. The route he chose crossed a zone under a formal climbing ban, imposed both for safety and out of respect for ancestral traditions. Trailhead signs clearly warned of legal penalties and asked visitors to honor the site. He ignored those signs. He began his approach at 2:30 in the morning to avoid ranger patrols. He carried his own protection and descended into terrain that had no maintained infrastructure because anchors had been deliberately removed when the ban took effect. The action was illegal, and the choice to climb at night was a deliberate attempt to evade detection. The mountain and the specific line he selected were restricted for two reasons. First, the volcanic rock on that face was andesitic and brittle, with a documented history of fracturing under repeated loading. Second, the area had been designated a sacred site by indigenous custodians, and formal management decisions had removed fixed anchors and routine maintenance. Local rangers and community leaders had issued explicit warnings about the lack of bolts and the risk of rock failure. Weather forecasts called for stable conditions overnight, and the climber relied on that window. Recent incident reports from the same corridor noted loose blocks and small collapses, the very reasons the route had been closed. Required permits and cultural clearances had not been obtained. His kit reflected a typical personal setup for a technical rappel and protection placement, but it was not a substitute for maintained anchors. In other words, the absence of infrastructure in the banned zone was not an oversight. It was intentional, and that fact was directly relevant to the outcome. Minutes into the descent, as he prepared to lower himself from the summit ridge, the sequence of failure began. As his weight was transferred onto a single protection placement on the summit face, the brittle andesitic rock fractured without warning. But as the anchor sheared away, the system went from safe to deadly in seconds. The rope paid out. He fell the full 300 feet to the scree field below. Impact forces were immediate and severe. The cascade was simple and direct. First, a maintained anchor was absent because the route was closed and fixed gear had been removed. Second, personal protection was placed in marginal fractured rock rather than solid host material. Third, the protection failed under dynamic loading and the climber fell 300 feet. Fourth, the fall converted vertical kinetic energy into blunt force trauma on impact with talus and broken rock. Fifth, the location and the illegal entry delayed coordinated rescue and complicated recovery. Temperatures were cool that pre-dawn, and the slope angle concentrated impact energy on the body rather than allowing sliding arrest. The physics were straightforward. A 300-foot free fall onto angular scree generated forces incompatible with survivable blunt trauma, and the physiology of such an event precluded immediate conscious response. Death was instantaneous from severe cranial trauma and multiple fractures. On clinical assessment, it would be described as catastrophic closed head injury with comminuted skull fractures and polytrauma with multiple long bone and axial skeleton fractures. Emergency responders who reached the scene later that morning reported that there were no vital signs and that injuries were not compatible with life. Because the fall was not survivable, no on-scene resuscitation attempts were able to restore spontaneous circulation. The body was located and documented, but the absence of maintained anchors and the restricted nature of the site complicated standard recovery procedures. Autopsy findings were consistent with high-velocity blunt impact and crushing injuries to the chest and head, and death was pronounced on scene by medical examiners. The account was recorded with clinical distance, and time to death was effectively instantaneous at the moment of impact. Investigations focused on the climber's decision to enter a restricted area without permits or cultural authorization. The Department of Conservation cited the violation and publicly stressed that the removal of infrastructure in banned zones is deliberate. Officials announced that future trespassers could face fines up to $100,000 and that guides must complete new training modules on cultural sensitivity and legal compliance. Local indigenous leaders emphasized that the restriction was a boundary intended to protect both people and place. Because the site had been entered illegally, standard rescue coordination was not in place, and recovery logistics were more complex. New enforcement measures and educational requirements were implemented, reinforcing the conclusion that bypassing legal and cultural protections removed safeguards intentionally designed to reduce risk. The incident was recorded as a case where rule-breaking directly contributed to a fatal outcome, and authorities reiterated that the absence of anchors in a closed zone was not a technical oversight, but a deliberate safety and cultural measure that cannot be bypassed without consequence. Opening hook. Illegal climbs were the through line in this series, and this segment was one of 8 cases where arrogance met altitude, with predictable consequences. These incidents did not happen despite rules, they happened because rules were ignored. Permit systems, registration, and simple safety protocols existed to prevent exactly what followed. This story showed how one solo decision erased the possibility of timely help, and how administrative tracking sometimes meant the difference between life and being lost without a trace. Illegal attempts had real costs, and this case made that plain. It was May 2019 when an unnamed 31-year-old American climber slipped quietly onto Denali, bypassing the Talkeetna Ranger Station and the required permit system. He was a 31-year-old American, known regionally for repeated solo ascents and for publicly rejecting what he described as unnecessary oversight. His record included multiple alpine solo routes and fast ascents on glaciated terrain, credentials that had earned him respect in certain circles, but not formal registration. He was described as confident, impatient with administrative rules, and determined to travel light. He was medium height, lean, and conditioned for endurance. He carried minimal load deliberately, choosing speed over redundancy. The illegal element was explicit and central. No permit, no registration, no check-in, and no beacon. He had bypassed checkpoints and avoided ranger contact to keep his presence invisible. For him, the objective had been a clean, untracked solo ascent of Denali, executed without permits or notification. His chosen method of travel sacrificed formal safety nets for solitude and speed, a decision he accepted as a personal principle rather than risk mitigation. Confidence and a deliberate rejection of oversight framed his choices from the outset. The context amplified the danger. The Kahiltna Glacier, above 16,000 feet on Denali, was a known maze of crevasses in spring, and snow bridges were thin and unstable as seasonal melt widened voids beneath the surface. The route he selected required permits not only for access but to enforce equipment standards, mandatory briefings, and the registration of beacons and itineraries. Rangers in Talkeetna had issued specific warnings that solo travel without a personal locator beacon would make any accident effectively invisible until late spring or summer. Weather forecasts available in late April and early May showed a pattern of daytime melt and overnight refreeze, a cycle that weakened bridges. Recent incidents on adjacent approaches had produced near misses, and one prior crevasse death on the same glacier in the previous 5 years. The very reason officials emphasized registration. He ignored those warnings, declined a beacon, and opted for minimal gear to preserve speed. Beacon and registration requirements existed because the terrain and seasonal conditions amplified the consequences of a single fall. Accident sequence. On his third day on the mountain, around 4 in the afternoon, a snow bridge failed beneath his weight. But as the snow gave way, a cascade of failures began. First, the surface sheared and he plunged nearly 40 feet into a crevasse, a vertical drop that immediately changed his condition from mobile to immobilized. Second, the fall produced high-energy blunt force trauma, fracturing his femur and pelvis and rendering him unable to climb back out. Third, the crevasse interior was cold and stagnant, with ambient temperatures at the floor measured approximately -15 degrees Celsius, a thermal environment hostile to survival without shelter. Fourth, because no beacon, registration, or itinerary existed, no automated alert was sent, and no ground search was triggered for days. Fifth, blood loss from pelvic injury, combined with pain and the onset of hypothermia, degraded his physiology rapidly. The physics were simple and brutal. The fall generated deceleration forces that produced displaced fractures, and pelvic disruption allowed internal hemorrhage that could not be evacuated. The enclosed crevasse prevented solar heating or wind convection, so his metabolic heat loss outpaced his capacity to generate warmth. Over the following hours, he entered shock, circulation compromised, and core temperature declined steadily. A chain of human choices and environmental facts turned a single fall into a fatal collapse of options. Invisibility in the park registration system directly removed the possibility of a timely rescue. Death description. Clinical signs were consistent with combined traumatic injury and progressive hypothermia. He sustained a displaced femoral fracture and pelvic ring disruption, injuries associated with significant internal bleeding and impaired mobility. Without hemorrhage control or surgical intervention, blood loss reduced effective circulating volume and contributed to hypotension and shock. Simultaneously, core temperature declined toward levels incompatible with consciousness. Emergency response could not be initiated because no emergency signal existed. There was no personal locator beacon and no filed itinerary, so no search began until weeks later. Time to death was estimated within a range based on physiological progression, most likely between 24 and 36 hours after the fall, as hypothermia progressed from mild to severe and as hemorrhagic shock advanced. The body was located 3 weeks later by a registered team that noted abandoned gear at the crevasse rim. Recovery operations were slow and hazardous due to unstable ice and the remote location. Hypothermia and hemorrhagic shock were the primary medical descriptors used in the coroner summary. Consequences. The investigation confirmed there was no record of his climb in park systems and no beacon registration in the region. Officials cited the case as proof that administrative tracking and mandatory safety equipment saved lives by enabling rapid response. In 2020, Denali National Park instituted mandatory beacon registration and daily check-in requirements for all parties on major routes, closing the loophole that had permitted unrecorded solo travel. Enforcement was increased at Talkeetna Ranger Station, and ranger briefings were emphasized in permit issuance. The policy change was described by park staff as targeted at preventing invisible accidents and improving search and rescue outcomes. Registration and beacon rules were framed as practical interventions that directly addressed the failure mode in this case. Closing CTA. If these stories of arrogance meeting altitude shocked you, click to watch the next case in the series. More accounts followed, 8 in all, each a different demonstration of how breaking rules on big mountains carried predictable and often fatal consequences. Click to continue and learn what mistakes to avoid. It was January 2021 when a 35-year-old climber from the Pacific Northwest arrived at Mount Rainier's northern boundary, aiming for a winter ascent of Liberty Ridge. He was no stranger to technical routes and cold conditions, with multiple cascade summits and a reputation for impatience with seasonal closures. Tall and athletic, and outspoken about what he called nanny state regulations, he dismissed the National Park Service winter ban as unnecessary bureaucracy. The closure was not subtle, with prominent signage at all official trailheads, online alerts from the Northwest Avalanche Center, and repeated warnings from local guides. Avalanche danger was listed as extreme above 11,000 feet, with recent storm cycles depositing over 4 feet of new snow in less than a week. He bypassed the main approaches, choosing an unmonitored gully to avoid detection. He carried no permit, skipped the mandatory winter registration, and left no itinerary with rangers. Liberty Ridge in January presented a classic slab avalanche hazard. The route's 38-degree slope angle at 11,000 feet, 3,353 meters, matched the prime zone for wind-loaded slab release. Meteorological bulletins had forecast a rapid warming trend, creating a weak layer beneath the fresh accumulation. But as he traversed a convex rollover at 10:48 a.m., the slope fractured. A hard slab, estimated at 60 feet wide and 2 feet deep, broke loose. The climber was swept 400 vertical feet downslope, then buried under an estimated 15 feet, 4.5 meters of debris. Snow temperatures inside the debris measured -5 degrees Celsius. Without a partner or beacon, and with the area closed to legal climbers, no one witnessed the event or triggered a search. Forensic analysis later determined asphyxiation occurred within minutes, with hypothermia as a secondary factor. The body remained undetected until July, when summer melt exposed fragments of equipment near the glacier's edge. Recovery required technical teams and drone mapping because terrain remained unstable. Emergency medical intervention was not possible on scene, and no immediate rescue had been triggered because the area had been closed and the climber had not registered. Time to death was estimated in minutes for asphyxia, with systemic hypothermia contributing over the following hours. The incident was recorded clinically as fatal asphyxia due to avalanche burial, with concurrent hypothermia and traumatic injury. The National Park Service investigation cited criminal trespass and violation of closure orders. In response, Rainier authorities installed a year-round digital monitoring system in 2022, including electronic closure gates and remote cameras. Criminal charges for future winter violations now carried fines and potential jail time. The Liberty Ridge incident was cited in public safety briefings as a textbook case of a preventable avalanche fatality resulting from deliberate defiance of seasonal closures. It was September 2018 when a 28-year-old climber from Central Europe arrived at Cho Oyu Chinese base camp with a forged permit. He had obtained the document through a black market intermediary to avoid the $3,000 official fee. On paper, he was listed as part of a sanctioned group, but in reality, he planned to climb alone, carrying a single oxygen cylinder, without Sherpa support, and without a registered logistics plan. The forged permit let him bypass routine scrutiny by Chinese authorities, and it also severed him from the formal safety net that permits and registration were designed to provide. There was no emergency radio, no backup team, and no coordinated oxygen schedule tied to an authorized expedition. Cho Oyu North Side rises to 8,188 meters and required strict compliance with permit and logistics rules. Climbers were expected to join authorized expeditions, file detailed logistics, and register all supplemental oxygen. Autumn storms swept the high plateau, and temperatures at high camps dropped below -25 degrees Celsius. Official briefings that season warned of deteriorating weather and the necessity of backup oxygen above 7,000 meters. The climber ignored those warnings and relied on his fake credentials to move ahead. His plan left him 2 cylinders short for a safe summit push. He pressed on anyway, confident that speed and determination would compensate for the missing resources, and that the paperwork would keep him invisible to enforcement. At 7,315 meters, 24,000 feet, his condition deteriorated. He developed severe shortness of breath and a persistent cough. Heart rate climbed to 130 beats per minute as fluid accumulated in his lungs, the clinical presentation of high-altitude pulmonary edema, commonly spoken as HAPE. Without supplemental oxygen and without a support team, descent was slow. By 1840, he had collapsed just below Camp 2, isolated and unnoticed, with no radio check-in and no rescue beacon to alert nearby teams. Overnight, his respiratory function worsened. By first light, he was unresponsive. 2 days later, a legally registered expedition located the body and notified Chinese authorities. Medical analysis confirmed acute respiratory failure due to high-altitude pulmonary edema. The absence of official registration meant no emergency response was triggered when his condition first began. Recovery and coordination were restricted to climbers registered with authorized expeditions, which delayed discovery and intervention. The investigation documented forged documents and a complete lack of sanctioned logistics, including no registered oxygen plan and no emergency communications. In 2019, China implemented a digital permit system requiring QR code registration for all climbers to prevent paper forgeries. The incident resulted in a 5-year ban for permit fraud and was cited as a case study in the limitations of administrative deception at extreme altitude. The clinical facts were clear. The illegal permit removed the safety layers that would have enabled timely rescue. It was April 2019 when a 42-year-old professional mountain guide from France arrived in Nepal, intent on leading his private clients up a Himalayan peak, despite an emergency closure issued just days earlier. The region had been rocked by a magnitude 6.2 earthquake, and the Department of Tourism had suspended all climbing activity and ordered evacuations of base camps. He was known in the guiding community for technical skill and assertive leadership, a medium build with weathered features, and a reputation for dismissing bureaucratic restrictions. In the days before the climb, he posted frustration with official orders, insisting that decades of experience gave him better judgment than distant authorities. He assured his clients the route was manageable and argued that closures were overreactions suited to amateurs. The decision to proceed was deliberate. He bypassed checkpoint controls, coordinated a night approach to avoid patrols, and ignored repeated warnings from local liaison officers. He carried no authorized permit, and his insurance coverage was invalidated by the violation. The legal and professional risk was explicit, with penalties for unauthorized entry into the disaster zone. The mountain had changed in the aftermath of the quake, and the upper icefall was now riddled with fresh crevasses and overhanging seracs that had been loosened by seismic shock. Official advisories described the route as critically hazardous, with serac masses estimated at over 800 tons perched above the standard crossing. Temperatures hovered at -18 degrees Celsius, and aftershocks continued to rattle the glacier. Local guides refused to join, citing the unpredictability of post-quake ice movement. Meteorological bulletins forecast further instability, with high winds and sub-zero wind chills expected through the week. He dismissed these warnings, insisting his knowledge of the terrain would compensate for the altered conditions. He carried standard technical gear but omitted specialized rescue equipment, arguing it was unnecessary for a rapid push. No radio registration, no GPS beacon registration, and no emergency evacuation plan were filed with authorities. Recent incidents, including a major serac collapse that had killed 16 Sherpas in 2015, were fresh in local memories, but he treated those events as irrelevant to his ascent. At 7:10 a.m., While crossing the upper icefall at approximately 19,200 feet, the guide led his clients onto a snow bridge spanning a newly formed crevasse field. A low-frequency rumble, characteristic of shifting seracs, preceded the event by less than 10 seconds. Then, an 800-ton block of ice sheared off from the overhanging face above, struck the slope, and triggered a chain reaction collapse. The snow bridge failed instantly, dropping the guide and two clients more than 200 feet, 61 meters, into a crevasse filled with jagged ice formations. The impact produced multiple fractures, massive internal hemorrhage, and blunt force trauma. Temperatures inside the crevasse measured -18 degrees Celsius, accelerating hypothermia. The clients died on impact. The guide, critically injured but initially conscious, managed to activate a personal locator beacon, but the transmission was not registered with any official rescue network because his climb was illegal and unregistered. Over the next 8 hours, he experienced progressive hypovolemic shock and worsening hypothermia, which culminated in cardiac arrest. Rescue operations were complicated by the ongoing closure and the unstable terrain. A helicopter sent by a private operator attempted to hover above the crevasse, but was forced to abort after repeated aftershocks destabilized the landing zone. Ground teams, lacking authorization to enter the closed area, were delayed for hours while officials assessed risk to rescuers. Medical attempts at extrication were constrained by the crevasse geometry, by ongoing seismic activity, and by the absence of a coordinated incident plan registered with authorities. Evacuation was further impeded because no formal manifest or permit record identified the party, and insurance and rescue protocols had been voided by unauthorized entry. The body locations were recorded, and operations were suspended when continuing instability made further approach untenable. An investigation later confirmed that the climb had violated the emergency closure and that the guide had bypassed checkpoints and ignored direct warnings. Findings emphasized that the lack of registration and the failure to carry specialized rescue equipment directly reduced the chance of a timely rescue. Local authorities reported that the illegal ascent increased operational risk for rescuers and delayed response time. Administrative consequences were imposed, and public statements from the Department of Tourism stressed that closures existed to prevent precisely this kind of cascade of events in altered terrain. Recovery and legal follow-up were complicated by the location within the closed zone and by continuing safety concerns for recovery teams. By the time a recovery team reached the site, all three climbers were deceased. Medical examination identified the cause of death as polytrauma with exsanguination and severe hypothermia. The bodies remained in situ for several days, until conditions stabilized enough for removal. The Department of Tourism launched a formal investigation, documenting the deliberate violation of emergency closure orders and the absence of required permits. The guide's actions were cited as gross professional misconduct, resulting in a lifetime ban from all Nepal mountaineering activities and revocation of his international guiding license. His family was billed $100,000 to cover rescue and recovery costs, and his name was added to a public registry of banned operators. Authorities increased patrols and imposed stricter penalties for future violations, including mandatory insurance forfeiture and criminal charges for unauthorized entry during closures. The incident became a case study in the dangers of disregarding emergency orders, reinforcing that professional expertise offers no immunity when natural forces and legal boundaries are ignored. Across all 8 cases, one pattern stands out. Regulations exist precisely because nature is indifferent to ego. No level of skill can outsmart a mountain when critical safety rules are ignored. Today, every illegal ascent still risks turning a calculated climb into a fatal lesson. In high-altitude environments, arrogance is not just reckless, it is terminal. If these stories fascinated you, hit subscribe for more real-world consequences.